presidents. And putting it in the most simple terms, you could say that for Clinton, between 92 and 2000, who was by any stretch of the imagination, if you mark success as being popular when he left office, and he was therefore a successful president who oversaw 8 years of economic growth. But I kind of put Clinton very much in the debate about globalization. And in some ways, he was extraordinarily successful at selling globalization. But you could say that one of the ways and one of the consequences of his selling of globalization was to leave a whole series of problems behind, as a result of globalization, which began to manifest themselves in the late 90s. But of course, later on, were used as a principal vehicle for Trump to attack the political establishment under the general banner of populism. I also deal with Clinton for the very important reason that he was the first American US president after the end of the Cold War who had to deal with the disintegration of the USSR in the Yeltsin years before the onset of Putin. And again, although he thought at the time he was being highly successful in dealing with Russia, I think the truth of the matter is, and we're seeing that manifested today, and it's another part of the crisis, with not only the rise of Putin, which followed Yeltsin, but also if you like, the radicalization of the Putin presidency since Putin took over in 2000. With the Bush administration, the G.W. Bush administration, clearly the central question is 9/11, the so-called war on terror, the war of choice to go to war in Iraq, and of course, I suppose you might call it the war of choice, the war which is not a war of choice, the Afghanistan war. Now, there was a big debate at the time, and Ken, myself, and others were involved in that when I was still in Aberystwyth. The big debate at the time about the nature of the response to 9/11. There was bound to be a reaction to 9/11. Ken and I think, were at a conference somewhere in mid-Wales when the attack occurred. It was a huge shock. Its long-term consequences, I think, have been not just in terms of dealing with, quote unquote, something called terrorism, but also this segued and morphed into a decision over Afghanistan, which was fairly uncontroversial at the time, although it's become so since, particularly given the disastrous way in which the US finally got out of Afghanistan. But the most important significant one was the decision on Iraq. And again, it seems to me, if we're looking at the onset of what we might call the agony of the American empire, the crisis is not only manifested under Trump in terms of a critique of globalization, which Clinton had promoted so fiercely in the 1990s. The crisis, secondly, is also a crisis of the purposes and use of American power, particularly in Iraq, because that war was so controversial, so contested, did not go through the UN. It raises all sorts of questions about legitimacy and the role of international law. And even today, when Putin is making his justification for, and China too, the justification for supporting Russia in Ukraine, which obviously China is doing, and Russia is obviously actively participating in, given it's the aggressor. Nonetheless, it's quite interesting to see how many people around the world talk about American double standards and that they've got no right to criticize Russia because of the double standards. And much of this, it says, again, goes back to the decision to go to Iraq and the consequences there, and to some degree also in Afghanistan. You know, that you sow the seeds, but you also reap the crop, and the crop is still coming home with the whole debate today, even about the interventions by the US. And again, it is used in the wider debate today over Russia's actions in Ukraine. I move on quickly then to Obama. And again, each of the presidents confronts the same problems, but Obama's fundamental question wasn't war on terror or intervening in the Middle East, which came to define the Bush presidency, nor, of course, the whole question about globalization, which came really to become the central feature of the Clinton administration. But clearly, what fundamentally confronted Obama more than anything else was the 2008 economic and financial crisis. This huge meltdown on Wall Street, which began in late 2007, manifested itself through a series of closures of big finance companies, and concluded, at least by the end of that year, with the collapse of Lehman Brothers in September of that particularly momentous year in 2008. Now, the consequences of the financial crash were not only American consequences, they were global consequences. In China, it led to 20 million people being unemployed temporarily, because China then went into a period of huge government spending and intervention on infrastructure. It had a huge impact in Europe. It nearly destroyed Greece as an economy, because the spin-off into the Euro crisis in Greece. But that Euro crisis was also manifest right across Europe, and of course it undermined the American argument that our model of economy, our model of doing economics, is the best. So in a way, it wasn't just an economic meltdown, and it clearly was a great one, with a huge shock and a huge impact, by the way, on Americans' living standards and social mobility and all sorts of other things, and job opportunities, which still runs through the system even to this day. But I think it also, as one of Clinton's earlier advisors, Roger Altman, said, it was a geostrategic setback. And it's quite interesting too, looking at, again, going back to the theme of agony of empire, and what has happened to the United States since it won the Cold War and saw the end of the USSR. I think, again, it was a major factor in undermining the kind of notion that America represented the future. I think this was really very, very significant, because until then, you could say America represented the future. I mean, whatever the problems of the Middle East, whatever the problems to do with globalization, whatever the problems to do with a whole series of other things, including the use of torture in the war on terror, Guantanamo and all that, that had certainly eroded some degree of faith. But the 2008 crisis, I think, reinforced a trend line. And many books started to appear, some of which I reviewed at the time and I'm still talking about today in my lectures here at the LSE, a kind of new declinism set in the academic and policy literature. Almost until then, and certainly through the 1990s, the so-called Unipolar Moment, do people remember that? In that period, and even under Bush, in the first flush of what appeared to be the first successes of the intervention, both in Afghanistan and Iraq, the general view was that the United States was still on top of the world. And indeed, there was a whole literature which came into being in the late 90s and in the first few years of the G.W. Bush administration, which talked really quite dramatically about an American empire. A new American century was coming towards us, using that term first deployed by Henry Luce, the Time magazine editor, back in 1941. So a lot of people started talking about a new American century. With the crash, with 2008 and all the global and American and economic and political consequences of that, I think, if you like, there was a tilt. There's a huge tilt in perceptions of America, and indeed in America itself and externally. And that, in turn, led to what we would call a new literature of declinism. And you can simply see the acceleration of publications of books with the word decline in the title. And of course, the great English internationalist historian Paul Kennedy, who had first wrote that book back in 1987 called The Rise and Fall of Great Powers, he, in a way, became quite optimistic again that his original thesis about decline of all great powers, including, by the way, that of the United States. In the 1990s, of course, he had been very, very strongly criticized and attacked. Why Paul Kennedy was wrong became almost a kind of minor industry. But now, of course, Paul Kennedy felt himself back, and he wrote a couple of things I remember for Chatham House, why decline is back on the agenda. And certainly, by the way, in China, and I was teaching there at the time, there was a very interesting debate going on amongst Chinese intellectuals in China. And there was in China a kind of belief that the United States, the era of American dominance was over, that America was already in decline. And I think that may have also changed Chinese perceptions and policies towards the United States. So Obama's main task, and it's often forgotten now, and certainly the Trump 4 years did not want anybody to remember that, but the real objective of Obama, first and foremost, was to make sure that the 2008 crisis did not segue into a 1930s depression. And it's very interesting to read the economic literature of the time, particularly people like the Federal Reserve Chair, Ben Bernanke. He said very clearly, when President Obama formally became president in January of 2009, when with the inauguration, his first cabinet meeting brought together all the economic advisors, said, we face a potential 1930s. That's how seriously it was seen. And therefore, Obama had to take most radical economic measures, which had begun under Bush, but really continued. And by the way, I think one of the reasons Obama became president of the United States was precisely because of the financial crash. It's quite interesting, again, if you do polls and pollsters and listen to pollsters, I listen to them sometimes, not all the time, but it's quite interesting. Until about August, the Democrats and the Republicans were running head to head, about equal. The Lehman crash, the disintegration of Lehman Brothers itself, opened up a huge opportunity, which Obama very successfully and skillfully exploited, and became therefore the first African-American president in history. Not an insignificant move, to be sure, given America's race relations history, and something I think people don't talk about enough, to be perfectly honest. And secondly, of course, opened up the possibility of a more radical approach, and not radical in a left-wing sense, but certainly radical in Keynesian terms, of dealing with the crash. And as you saw, very, very quickly, the Fed moved, it was already moving in the last months of Bush, moved very, very radically to lower interest rates virtually to zero. We entered the era of cheap money. Obama actually intervened to save two of the major car industries, Chrysler and GM. There was massive backing for the banks, too big to fail. In fact, you could almost say you were too small to fail. So the banks simply were underwritten by federal taxation, as everybody said, you know, Main Street paid for Wall Street. But it also left a legacy, again, which Trump exploited very brilliantly, actually, and very ruthlessly in his own campaign, that the ordinary guy, the ordinary worker, had been sidelined, if you like, by the crash, that the rich finance guys, many of whom were Democrats, by the way, they're not all Republicans. New York bankers are probably overwhelmingly more Democratic than Republican, insofar as New York is more Democratic than the Republican. Trump really brilliantly exploited that populist argument. You can see it, you know. Why should all the rich guys on Wall Street, well-connected, and also proponents of globalization, who want more trade with China, why did they get away with it? While millions of ordinary Americans, workers, lost their jobs, lost their houses, could no longer afford their mortgages, or could afford to send their children to college, or found it very, very difficult to do so. So again, the deep seeds of the Trump presidency, which does represent, I think, of the real moment of the agony of the American empire and American power, the seeds of Trumpism were again sown, further sown as a result of the 2008 crisis. There's the two other things I'd like to say briefly, and I'm sorry to go through it chronologically, but that's the way I've dealt with it in the book. So I'm only following what I say in the book. I think the two other things that Obama dealt with, well or badly, and I'll leave it up to others to kind of think about that. Firstly, Obama came at a certain moment of the so-called Arab Spring. And that Arab Spring, as it was then called, certainly not called that now, I suppose, by most people, given what the outcome has been. But I think this segued little by little, and of course, affected Syria, with the disastrous consequences, as we know, for Syria. Now, I'm not going to go into all that, but Obama made a very clear statement when there will be there's a red line which shall not be crossed if the Syrian government uses chemical weapons. And for all, as we seem to know, or certainly it's alleged, those weapons were deployed, although some would dispute that, and Obama didn't cross the red line. So there was a kind of an argument that Obama kind of talked the talk but didn't walk the walk, to use a phrase. And this kind of weakened American credibility as a great power. So, decline is not only an objective fact, it can also be about perception. And I think, again, what Trump exploited very well, that under Obama, there was a perception that the United States was no longer deterring, was no longer acting as a great power, and the failure to do anything over Syria. I'm not sure anything could have been done over Syria, but that's my own view. But the failure to act in Syria demonstrated weakness. By demonstrating weakness, this undercut American deterrent power, which is so important for international global stability. That's the kind of argument. Whether or not you buy into that, I'll leave to you to think about. But I think that was an important moment in the history of the Trump presidency. The second and bigger question, I suppose, if you call it a bigger question, was what to do about the shift of power in the world. Because whereas I think G.W. Bush can be seen as a kind of straightforward unipolarist who basically thought America was going to run the world forever and then found out that it couldn't, and it could intervene in country after country and succeed, but in the end failed in both occasions, both in Afghanistan and Iraq. It was kind of classical hubris on behalf of Bush. It wasn't classical hubristic foreign policy. We've got the power, we can use it, we will always succeed. As Thucydides pointed out in the great history of the Peloponnesian Wars, hubristic great powers who think they can achieve everything in the end burn and crash, as happened to Athens. This is what happened to the United States over the Middle East, in effect, to some degree anyway. I think, however, with Obama, I think he was kind of saying, I'm learning that lesson, and I think we've got to do something different. We've got to adjust to a changing world order. And part of that adjustment was adjustments to both the rise of Russia, the emergence of Russia. The rise of Russia is probably putting it too strongly, but I think you know what I mean. The very reality of Russia. There had been 10 years good economic growth under Putin in the first 10 years. We now can forget that now. It gets lost in the fog of time. But the first 10 years of Putin had reinforced Putin's position. The GDP of Russia more or less doubled. Living standards went up. Wages were paid. Pensions were paid. So Putin became fairly popular within Russia. And I think Obama probably recognized, well, we've got to deal with this issue, even though it's not going to be very, very easy to do so. And there was that whole moment, what they called the reset with Russia, which again, he was much criticized for trying to do. It seemed to me a chance to try and rebuild the relationship with Russia. And there were some very important measures that were taken at the time, but that soon went out the window, of course, very, very rapidly after the Russian intervention in Georgia, and then subsequently, of course, the Russian intervention in what I call the first Ukraine war in 2014. So that particular policy clearly didn't work, although there was an argument to be made on the US side for trying it at least. And the second question was really about China. What to do about China. Now, hitherto, the US line on this, and it had been consistent across all presidencies, was that China was a rival, but more importantly, China could become what they called a responsible stakeholder. China could be integrated essentially into the world market economy. And this was the whole point of pushing for China to join the World Trade Organization, the WTO, in 2001, which the Americans strongly pushed, by the way. But that went back to Clinton, who was very keen to bring China into the global economy. G.W. Bush followed the same strategy, as indeed did Obama. There was it was a kind of liberal theory of international relations, which has been much promoted by somebody like John Eikenberry at Princeton in his work on liberal internationalism. A liberal order is an order which you can ultimately buy into. It's difficult to get into the club, but once you're in the club, it's very difficult to leave the club. It's kind of putting Eikenberry's argument very, very simply in a way I don't suppose that John Eikenberry would fully recognize, but I think you understand what I'm trying to say. And that really did inform, I think, the policies, of people like Clinton, then Bush, and indeed Obama in his first years in office after 2008. And so Obama did really and seriously think about what this meant. should you adjust to a rising power? And that, in a way, became the biggest question of all over time, not so much what was happening in the Middle East or even what was happening in the European Union, but also fundamentally, it was about China. And in a way, you could say that while there had been a big debate about China within the United States hitherto, and there had been, right through Clinton, through the Bush period, and Obama really raised it to the very top of the agenda. And I'm not sure they came up with an easy answer to, quote unquote, what to do about China. As liberals, and Obama was one, obviously, he did kind of buy into the argument of people like John Eikenberry, I think, which kind of said that China could be turned into a responsible stakeholder, could be integrated into the order. And although its domestic scene would not change fundamentally, nonetheless, with economic reforms at home, greater engagement of capital within China, China trading more and more with the outside world, particularly with the United States and the European Union, but also in its own region, China, in a sense, would become so dependent on the world market, and indeed underpinning that, the liberal world order, or the liberal international economic order, that it becomes so dependent that it could in no way want to challenge it. Why would you want to challenge an order from which you were benefiting so much? And China itself, through the 1990s under Hu Jintao, and even in the first years of Xi Jinping, did talk very positively about globalization, talk very positively about globalization and becoming part of the global economic order. But at the same time, what Obama also did, and I think he was then being under pressure from another wing of the debate, the more realist wing of the debate. I'm not sure if he read John Mearsheimer, but nonetheless, the kind of views such as Mearsheimer's, that China could not rise peacefully. There was no way a rising power could simply rise within the system. In the end, as John Mearsheimer had argued consistently throughout, as we know, he's still saying the same today. So John Mearsheimer has always been very consistent, at least. He argued that, in essence, China cannot be integrated. A very direct critique of what I would call the Eikenberry view on China. That it's a great power. It's a tragedy, to use the title of his own book, Tragedy of Great Power Politics, a very influential book, of course. But through the tragedy of great power politics, it's not that we dislike China. It's not just because China is communist, or because we kind of don't really like China as a system, although that's part of the story. It is in essence about power in the purest, almost Hans J. Morgenthau sense of the word power politics. Politics amongst nations is about power amongst nations. And I think the Obama administration, in a sense, moved between those two alternative positions, one liberal, which I think was exemplified in the theoretical work of people like Eikenberry, and one realist, more exemplified in the work of somebody like Mearsheimer. And I think from that perspective, there was already beginning a tilt under Obama, both to integrating China and seeing China as responsible stakeholder. I think that lingered on within the US administration, yet at the same time, one can begin to detect on another wing or another side of the Obama administration, the notion that rising China is also presenting a problem. It was presenting a problem from the US in terms of the South China Seas, the claims that China was making in the South China Seas. You had a new president, of course, who came into office in 2012, 2013, Xi Jinping, who started to say very, very different things about China's role in the world. And so therefore, under the Obama, in the Obama years, there was increasing, I'd say, a tilt away from the kind of what I call the Eikenberry view toward not exactly the Mearsheimian view, but certainly a more, what you might say, a more realist view, which in a sense also prepared the way for the Trump administrations, then going right over to the other views as China as enemy, China as rival, China not as anything like a responsible stakeholder, which can be integrated into the international order. Which brings me then quickly, after that, kind of going through the other, to the Trump period. Trump is quite difficult to understand in many ways. I mean, partly, I suppose, because the nature of the man, the nature of the appalling things he said on so many questions, and the nature of the fact that as these recent congressional hearings onto January the 6th have demonstrated, Trump simply tried to overturn the result of an election. He first tried to do it peacefully by putting pressure on the Justice Department, then putting pressure on Georgia and the Secretary of State in Georgia and in Arizona, So can you find me 11,000 votes? And then when he couldn't do it peacefully, it was done violently. And that's what happened with January the 6th. And by the way, and this is the worrying thing for the United States today, and again represents some part of this agony of the empire, agony of American power, over half of all Republicans, voting Republicans, believe Trump. They actually do believe that the election was stolen. They don't believe that Biden is a legitimate president. And that tells you a hell of a lot about the crisis inside the United States. And I've sometimes argued that the American structural power still remains formidable. I've made this argument time and again, as Ken knows. I see Nick Wheeler's there too. I've always made the case that American structural power is still very formidable. You know, if you look at its percentage control of the world economy, it's still about 20 to 23% of world GDP, whichever form of GDP you use. Its military, it spends more on the military than the next 7 or 8 countries put together. It can project military power around the world. It has 11 aircraft carrier groups, which can go anywhere around the world. It has the primacy of the dollar and many, many other assets. Also, by the way, it's got some formidable corporate power. And also, when the Federal Reserve decides to make decisions, that will impact on the rest of the world. So the structural power of the United States still remains, it seems to me, formidable. And this is where there's a kind of contradiction in my book, really, in a way, or trying to work out the paradox, what I call, of American power, that it still retains this formidable structural power, whatever the problems have been, which I've already alluded to, starting with Clinton, going through Bush, and continuing through Obama, failure to reset Syria and all that, and the new declinist literature. On the other hand, the structural power remains real. On the other hand, why therefore do many people therefore perceive America to be in such crisis? And is this to do with what's going on outside the United States? Well, to some degree, obviously so. The withdrawal from Afghanistan was a disaster. America is engaged in an uncertain war, and we don't know the end of this war in Ukraine. You know, America's soft power has clearly declined as a result of Trump. There's no doubt about that. Many allies also believe that Biden is going to be a one-term president, and that something like Trump or Trump-like is going to come back. So, you know, all bets are off about the future. But this tells us, therefore, more about domestic politics in the United States, which brings me then to what I think is the real issue about the agony of American power, or the agony of the United States empire. It may not be about its decline as an international actor. As I've said, I think its structural power resources still remain huge. Nobody really comes close to it. Even China, in many ways, although it's a global power becoming more global, nonetheless, I think doesn't compare, at least for the moment, with the United States. It might do in 10, 20, 30, 40 years' time. So you've got the structural power of the United States on the one hand as an international global actor. On the other hand, it faces just massive, huge domestic problems. And I've been struck looking at the literature as well as looking at these recent congressional hearings, thinking this is a country in agony. You go back to the title of my book. Americans are polarized. You know, they've never been more divided. There is a refusal on one side or the other to believe the other side is legitimate. As I said, Republicans, half of them at least, more, maybe more, believe that the election was stolen. Even on cultural issues of sexuality, you've recently seen the decisions by the Supreme Court on Roe versus Wade, on gun control. You know, the United States is now more polarized than it's ever been for tens of years. Indeed, during the Cold War, for most of the Cold War at least, except during the 60s, you know, the United States at least could unite around a Cold War enemy. It doesn't have that easy privilege any longer. And again, I think that's having internal conflict, as well as big social changes in the United States as well, huge social changes which have taken place almost behind the screen, really. You know, what's been going on, lots of manufactured jobs, decline of industrial north, changing mores, changing ideas about values of family and sexuality. All these things are adding to this very, very deep divide in the United States. And I suppose I end really, and I should bring this about an end now because I'm sorry about the delay, but I want to leave you then with that kind of argument, which comes from the book, which is that, as I've said, whether it's decline in what we call the traditional IR sense, or whether it's a question of the crisis of America and American society at home, I'll leave it with you, because I tend to think that what we're looking at, therefore, is less the first, although there are obstacles to American power. One of them, of course, is clearly going to be China, but also, as we're seeing in Russia can't be written off, as we've seen. I mean, people have been talking about Russian decline for the last 10, 15 years, and, you know, Russia still has some assets, including military and energy assets, and it also has, by the way, friends in the world. Whether people like to believe it or like this in the West, the Russian narrative, which is also the Chinese narrative about that world, sells in large parts of the global South. You know, the South African government abstained. You know, the Indian government abstained on resolutions going through the UN. So, you know, this is very, very difficult for the US, because it's quite clear, and it does demonstrate that whatever its great formidable structural power may be, you know, selling its narrative is becoming much more difficult, I think. And I think that's the way I put it. So I'm not trying to underestimate the international problems it faces. They are real, but the underlying structural power, those assets and capabilities that we always used to measure in the Cold War, those still remain formidable. On the other hand, the domestic environment remains increasingly problematic. And I'm looking forward, without becoming overly dramatic about this, I don't see any easy way out of this. This is the next point. If the Republicans come back in the midterm elections, which I think they're almost likely to do without question, a future the Republican Party is no longer the Republican Party. It's a bit like the Conservative Party in Britain is a Brexit party now, not a Conservative Party. In the same way, the Republican Party is no longer the old-fashioned Republican Party of Ronald Reagan or Eisenhower. It is, in a sense, a populist party now. And the only way to get on in the Republican Party is to be a populist. And the only way, like in Britain, the only way to get on in the Tory party, although we're seeing these ridiculous discussions going on now around who's going to replace Boris Johnson. What a choice. You know, is to be more Brexit than the person next to you. So, but this also throws up, therefore, the two parties, therefore, are drifting further and further apart. And this reflects a deep polarization in American society. And I suppose learning one lesson from history, if we learn any lessons from history, I'm not so sure, but learning one lesson from history is, can an empire divided against itself in such a profound and long-term way retain its position of leadership, dominance, and within the international order, whatever capabilities it has. So I'll end on that note. I hope that gives you some indication of what's in the book. And I hope you go and read it and possibly even buy it. But again, I do apologize for the miscommunication on my part.
Oh, thank you so much, Professor Cox. Such a feast. What a fascinating speech it was to start our online conference, kind of the last day of the conference. And some of you may have already heard that already Eikenberry referred to your book as a compelling picture of unsettled superpower. And we don't have anyone better than you to explain. You started as a Soviet specialist focusing on the Cold War. I know you were a founding father of the LSE ideas, which was named as a second in the world of university-based think tanks in 2014. There are so many questions. We are very sorry, really thanking you on behalf of the organizers, and apologizing to all our audience here, and it's streaming online on YouTube, obviously, for the technical issues we have this morning. We will have 10 minutes if you have some more extra 10 minutes for us, maybe if there are any questions, please.
Sure,
I know there are, yeah, okay, great. Andrew, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much indeed. First of all, I'd like to thank Professor Cox for giving us all these tidbits from his very interesting and insightful book. My question to him is that in the light of these agonies, does it mean that there is going to be a transition from a so-called American-led liberal order to a more inclusive world where other ideologies and other development models can coexist? You mentioned China a few times, as if China, and you mentioned globalization. China, in fact, is continuing with globalization. This is supported by the fact that 130 countries around the world have China as the largest trading partner, compared with only 57 for the United States. So China is very much for globalization, but China doesn't buy the kind of mantra that there is only one ideology that fits all other countries. Now, and that comes back to the second point in this kind of consideration. There's a question of legitimacy. Now, there's always a kind of rhetoric that somehow the Chinese Communist Party is not legitimate, but according to the latest findings of Harvard Kennedy School, the Ash Center report, which came out a couple of months ago, looks at how peoples around the world, people in different countries, the degree of support of the government. And according to these findings, the support of the Chinese people for their government ranks top of the league in the world, multiple ranks above the United States, because the Chinese people's lives have totally been transformed under the Chinese Communist Party for the past 40 years. So, if a different model, a different ideology can also can be seen as legitimate, at least in the eyes of their own people, and then of course China is also embracing globalization, which is largely, but not totally, of course, following the World Trade Organization. You can talk about China's infringements, but that doesn't mean that China is going to throw out the whole thing. So my question is that, does it mean that there is going to be a transition to a more inclusive world order where different ideologies can coexist?
Yeah, well, thank you for those great questions, Andrew, and I'll obviously try and answer them directly. I think something is emerging. Clearly, I mean, one would have to be very blind not to notice that things have changed since the end of the Cold War, from the so-called unipolar moment. I think it'd be a very radical way to kind of think of the world today as still being unipolar, in the sense that it was back in the 1990s, when China was still relatively weak, and when the USSR was effectively disintegrating, and when the ideology of America, as it was seen then, the ideology of Americanism was driving all before it. So I agree with you. Clearly, there's a major shift and change. And a large part of that has in part been brought about by globalization itself. Namely, to put it in terms that I don't entirely like, but it's allowed entry for all sorts of other new players into the order, including China, which of course has embraced globalization, although was once suspicious of it, and including, by the way, India. And including another set of new emerging powers. And yesterday, by the way, Andrew, I gave a lecture on the Brics. The origin of the Brics, which began as an economic concept with Jim O'Neill, the British economist, but then segued into a political idea with the first summit held in Russia in 2009. And by the way, the Brics last month also held a conference at which, of course, Putin was in attendance with the other four. And I think that is part of the new order that is emerging. I don't want to call it a brick order, but that original idea of rising large emerging economies, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and of course, after 2010, South Africa. Okay, it may be more about China than anybody else, which you mentioned a lot there yourself, by the way. But nonetheless, there is a kind of a wider shift which is taking place. And I've always been one of those who said, don't oversell the Brics, but don't underestimate it. And I think quite a lot of Western economists went to the latter position of underestimating the Brics, almost writing it off. But if you look at what's happened during the Ukraine war, or whatever you want to call it, you can see quite clearly how the BRIC countries, which have been working with China, alongside Russia, since 2009, they've cooperated on a whole series of things. And I think that is the framing of this new order. It may not be just a Chinese-led order, which you stress, and I understand and perfectly legitimately to do so, because after all, China is bigger than the rest of the BRICS quite considerably. In fact, one of the power shifts I was talking about yesterday in my lecture at the LSE at summer school was not only has there been a sort of a beginnings of a real power shift, but where it's going to end up, I just don't know. So I can't find an easy answer to your question, but where it's going to, I think is going to be deeply significant. But that power shift is also happening within the BRICS. If you actually look in 2010, China is ahead of the other three, and then four. By now, it's even further ahead, economically speaking. So there's been a power shift, not only globally in terms of emerging powers, but also within the emerging powers, with China emerging, as you Correct. My only worry, and I don't know if it's a worry or a concern, but I think it's I'm not sure this new order is going to be very cooperative. That's the difference. I don't think that's a difference between us, but it's a point I'd make. I'm not sure this is going to be cooperative. If one, for instance, takes one statement, and I'll end on this with this note to Ayla. The 4th of February 2022, Putin visited Beijing for the time of the Winter Olympics in Beijing, and they put out a very long joint communique. And it struck me that communique, which reflected much of what has been said in the Brics for 10 years, by the way, there wasn't much that was original there, but it was a significant moment when it was drawn up and in detail. And I would almost say that's not a blueprint for a new world order. I think that's overdoing it. But nonetheless, it is quite clear that the order that they are looking for within the Brics, and the Brics, by the way, reinforce this position, is beyond the old Western-dominated US law order. And that may not therefore necessarily be a source of cooperation. One would like to think that, everybody could get together economically, culturally, work through the UN, but I'm sure you would understand this better than anybody, Andrew. That is simply not happening. On every fundamental question now, or most major questions, the divide between the two sides, if I can use that, has grown. Whether you see this in the UN, you see this with America's policies towards Russia and Ukraine, you can see this on IMF reform, you can see this in a whole range of other areas where there's very fundamental disagreement. So I think we are moving into a very new world. What the shape of that world is at the moment, I'm not too sure. Its outlines are not too clear to me, but I worry that this is certainly not going to be a cooperative one.
Yeah, thank you so much. What a privilege to hear a bit more detailed views on your book. Hopefully you'll be thinking about already your next book, Mick. I'm sure many of attendees, I hope they will go and buy such a fantastic book and join me maybe to thank virtually to upload and thank Professor Cox for this brilliant. I wish we had more time, but unfortunately
I wish we had more time. As Ken knows, I can talk forever.
Yeah, but it's just just to make sure that we don't have similar technical issues for the next
panel. I'm sorry
panel,
about that. I really am sorry about that.
But we are delighted to have you, and please join me virtually to give him to thank with your applauses. I think I don't know how they do it online. It was good. I'm doing it here. Thank you. Okay, yes.
Oh, Ken's clapping there. Very good. Hi, Ken. How are you? And there's Nick.
Yes.
Hi, Nick. You're looking very cool there, I have to say. Very cool.
Yeah,
by the way, Ayla, just as a little bit of advice, sorry, I will get off the line now. But I am working on a new book. It's on China-Russia relations. So,
I thought you will be, yes. Brilliant.
Yeah, I'm halfway through that. But again, thank you very much. Again, apologies to Ken and others and to yourselves, all the organizers, for the slight technical hitch on my end. All my fault, not yours. Okay, I hope the rest of the day goes well. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you. Bye.
See you guys. Bye-bye.